What if the greatest rebellion of the 21st century isn't loud, chaotic, or televised, but silent? A man doesn't slam the door. He doesn't scream. He just leaves, not out of fear, not out of failure, but out of something far more unsettling: clarity. Across cities, continents, and cultures, men are vanishing from the emotional grid, not into isolation, but into sovereignty, not into depression, but into stillness. They're walking away from dating, from relationships, from the entire idea of romantic entanglement. And they're doing it with surgical precision. You won't find them on dating apps. You won't hear them complain. They don't protest the rules of the game anymore. They've simply stopped playing. And it's not bitterness that drives this. It's something Dostoevsky warned us about long before Tinder or TikTok ever existed. That a man who sees through the illusion, who stares directly at the absurdity of human desire, cannot return a blindness without cost. So instead of returning, he turns inward. He builds. He sharpens. He disconnects. Not to escape, but to re-emerge, unchained. This isn't a movement. It's not a community. It's not a manifesto, but it's something much colder, much cleaner, a final retreat from the battlefield of romance. Not in defeat, but in ruthless triumph. And as you watch this unfold, ask yourself one question: what happens to a society when the men who once built it no longer see love as worth bleeding for? Because that question isn't just dangerous, it's revolutionary. There was a time when love was sacred. Not convenient, not logical, but sacred. It wasn't about compatibility or metrics. It was about obsession, mystery, devotion so consuming it made men starve, weep, and bleed. A glance from the right woman could dismantle an empire. A letter passed in secrecy held more meaning than 10,000 digital messages today. Love was a madness willingly embraced, a madness that defined greatness. And now, it's optimized, minimized, turned into a user interface with a subscription model and a swipe mechanic. Where once love demanded suffering, modern romance demands convenience. You don't need courage anymore. You need a filter. You don't need longing. You need a curated profile with the right lighting and bio. The modern man, the thinking man, sees this for what it is, not evolution, but dilution. He looks around and realizes he is no longer being asked to feel. He is being asked to perform, to audition for affection, to provide a list of socially acceptable traits, to project the image of the high-value male who ticks all the boxes: emotional availability, financial stability, sexual confidence, and yet never steps out of line. And for what? Fleeting attention, conditional intimacy, an emotional tightrope that snaps the moment he refuses to play the game. This isn't love. This is negotiation disguised as connection. And that's the moment the illusion collapses. He starts to remember that love, real love, was once something dangerous. It asked you to abandon reason. It pulled you into ecstasy and despair with equal force. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But now, modern love is branded as empowerment, consent forms, and calculated detachment. It comes pre-packaged with rules of engagement, power balances, red flags, and exit strategies. And somewhere deep in his gut, he feels it. Something sacred has been killed. Dostoevsky warned of this long before the age of swipes and situationships. In Notes from Underground, he writes, "To be too conscious is an illness, a real, thoroughgoing illness. Modern men are conscious now, painfully conscious. They see the patterns, the signals, the illusion of choice. They've read the scripts. They've seen the betrayal of trust go viral on every platform. They've calculated the risk-reward ratio and found the math unbearable. And once they know the ritual is rigged, playing along becomes humiliating. Because chasing a woman who views affection as leverage isn't romantic, it's degrading. So they stop chasing. Not because they can't love, but because they refuse to beg. They'd rather be alone in truth than partnered in delusion. This isn't bitterness, it's awakening. The man who steps back isn't broken, he's observant. He's realized that modern love, as it's sold to him, is a rigged marketplace. And he's no longer willing to sell his dignity for temporary companionship. He watches his peers break under the weight of false intimacy. He watches them twist themselves into shapes that aren't even theirs. He sees how easily love is revoked, not by failure, but by boredom. And the question begins to haunt him. If I have to become someone else to be loved, was I ever loved at all? No, he wasn't. And so he walks, not out of defeat, but out of something far more dangerous, a refusal to be deceived. He will not perform. He will not kneel. He will not hand over his soul for a relationship built on performance metrics. Because love isn't supposed to feel like strategy. And if that's all that remains, he'd rather feel nothing at all. Let's talk about Alex. Late 20s, well-read, well-dressed, makes 6 figures in tech, gym 5 days a week, sharp mind, controlled emotions, no addictions. He's the man every dating coach says women want. And yet, he isn't dating. He isn't chasing. He isn't participating. Not because he was rejected, because he refused to play. He ran the numbers, tracked the emotional inputs, the energy outputs, watch himself give more than he got over and over again. Not just money, time, attention, emotional effort. Each date felt like a job interview with moving goalposts. Each relationship became another arena where he had to perform to be seen. He wasn't loved. He was auditioned. Smile here, nod there, compliment gently. Be vulnerable, but not too soon. Be dominant, but only when asked. Pay the bill. Read the signals. Anticipate needs. But heaven forbid you ask for anything in return. And the moment he paused, the moment he stopped performing, he became disposable. So he left, not with anger, with silence. Because the most brutal cost wasn't financial. It was spiritual. The slow erosion of his worth in exchange for temporary significance. And here's the trap. If he says this out loud, he's labeled a misogynist. If he stays silent, he's complicit. If he tries again, he's exhausted. If he walks away, he's accused of being broken. Modern men are locked in a paradox. Step forward, you're a simp. Step back, you're a coward. Speak up, you're toxic. Shut up, you're weak. There is no move left that doesn't require bending. So they stop playing. Dostoevsky understood this conflict long before it was modernized. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits murder, not for money or revenge, but to prove to himself that he could, to test the limits of his autonomy. And modern men are doing the same, not through violence, but through withdrawal. They test their power by no longer chasing. And what they discover is unsettling peace, clarity, control. Once they stop dancing for attention, they begin to see the stage, the costumes, the expectations, the invisible spotlight. And it all starts to look like theater, not connection, not authenticity, just scripted roles. The man performs, the woman evaluates. And when the performance slips, the curtain drops. So he refuses to perform at all, not because he can't keep up, but because he refuses to become a puppet for affection. This is not incel rage. This is existential exhaustion. Men like Alex have built themselves up only to realize that value isn't the issue. Leverage is. You could be strong, wise, stable, and still be rejected. Not because you're lacking, but because worthiness today is defined by compliance, not character. And character can't be gamified. The modern man has learned the hard truth. Being good isn't enough. Being kind isn't enough. Being competent isn't enough. You must also be willing to lose yourself in the process. But what if he won't? What if he refuses to abandon himself just to be tolerated? That's when something terrifying happens. He finds peace, not the kind advertised in wellness apps, the kind that comes from non-attachment, from realizing that his value doesn't depend on anyone else's perception of him. He stops chasing, and in that stillness, he wakes up, he reads more, he lifts heavier, he works in silence. He watches the world burn itself out in algorithmic courtship rituals and feels nothing. And once a man tastes that kind of internal sovereignty, he doesn't return to the marketplace. Because why would he? Why would a lion crawl back into a zoo to beg for applause? Let them call him cold. Let them say he's emotionally unavailable. Let them invent labels to make sense of what they fear. Because what they fear is real. A man who finds peace in solitude is no longer controllable, no longer predictable, no longer profitable. And in a society that demands men earn love like a paycheck, his refusal is a revolution. There's something happening beneath the noise. It's not loud. It's not viral. It moves in whispers, in quiet decisions made behind locked doors and uninstalled apps. Men are leaving, not in protest, not in bitterness, not in defeat, but in peace. And that peace is terrifying to the machine. Because peace cannot be taxed. It cannot be bought, sold, or redirected towards someone else's agenda. Governments depend on men to become fathers, husbands, taxpayers. Corporations depend on men to feel not enough and buy their worth in pieces. Platforms depend on men to chase, validation, attention, relevance, endlessly. Desperation is profitable. Contentment is not. And so, when a man chooses peace over pursuit, silence over simulation, he becomes dangerous, because a man who needs nothing cannot be controlled. This isn't new. It is ancient. It is spiritual. The Yamabushi of Japan, warrior monks who abandoned the world to train in the harshest mountains, were not cowards. They were ascetics, men who rejected distraction for stillness, men who traded affection for clarity. Diogenes, who lived in a barrel, was approached by Alexander the Great and asked if he wanted anything. He answered, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." That wasn't arrogance. That was rebellion. Because the moment you want nothing from the world loses its grip on you. Tesla, celibate by choice, lived in devotion to his ideas. He saw romantic entanglement not as joy, but as fragmentation, a loss of intensity. He died alone, but changed the entire fabric of civilization. Asterisk and Dostoevsky, in The Idiot, created Prince Mishkin, a man so pure, so detached from manipulation, that society tried to destroy him out of sheer discomfort. These men were not outcasts. They were architects of the ungovernable self. And modern men, awakened, alienated, unamused, are beginning to walk the same path. Not into hatred, not into isolation, but into inner sovereignty. They have stopped asking what they're missing. They've started asking what they were giving away for free. Time, energy, focus, masculinity diluted to gain approval from a system designed to punish it. So they stopped. Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly. They declined the next date, ignored the next DM, turned down the invitation to perform. And something strange happened. Their minds sharpened, their sleep deepened, their training became obsessive. Their thoughts grew heavy, but clear. They no longer chased dopamine. They chased discipline. And that's when the panic began. Society relies on the assumption that men will always return to the loop. That after a phase of solitude, they will come crawling back, lonely, broken, ready to bargain. But some don't return because they've discovered something far more addictive than attention. Peace, a quiet room, a mind without chaos, a life without compromise. And this kind of man threatens the entire structure. He doesn't fear rejection because he no longer seeks approval. He doesn't need reward because he finds satisfaction in the work itself. He doesn't fear being alone because solitude is now sacred. He doesn't date for validation. He builds for legacy. And when asked, "Why aren't you trying?" he simply answers, "Because I've seen what it costs." When love becomes a leash, choosing solitude becomes the blade. This decision, multiplied across millions of men, is not just a trend. It's a fracture. It breaks something at the root of society's design. The assumption that men will always bend. But they're not bending anymore. They're standing still. And in that stillness, they become immovable. This isn't insuldom. This isn't bitterness. This is exit. A psychological, emotional, philosophical exit from a system that treats male energy as fuel to be extracted, never nurtured, never respected, never understood. The world calls these men cold. But cold things don't burn out. Cold things last. This isn't a tantrum. It's a transition from chaos to clarity, from performance to purpose, from chasing the illusion of love to mastering the truth of self. And that mastery is rebellion. Not the kind you post, the kind you live. There's a shift happening. You can't see it in the headlines. You can't measure it in likes or clicks. But if you listen closely to the silence between trends, you'll feel it. Men aren't choosing loneliness. They're choosing clarity. Clarity over chaos. Silence over noise. Purpose over performance. The world mistakes their stillness for sadness. But still water isn't dead. It's disciplined. They're not crying in their bedrooms. They're building, brick by brick, the lives no one thought they were capable of living without validation. Marriage rates plummet. Dating apps turn into deserts of disinterest. Romantic ambition is replaced with something far more dangerous to the system: internal focus. Men are waking up before dawn, not for someone else, but for themselves, to train, to read, to think without interruption. Their homes are quieter, their minds sharper, their days more deliberate. They are not chasing a partner. They are chasing precision. And what do they build in this clarity? They build bodies, not for approval, for power. They build businesses, not for status, for sovereignty. They build bookshelves, not to impress, but to understand. Because every page read is one step further from manipulation. Every muscle gained is one layer thicker between him and desperation. Every hour spent alone is another brick in the wall that protects him from the circus. This is not some fringe lifestyle choice. It's a mass withdrawal from the matrix of need, because external validation is bait, and every bait leads to a cage. The cage of always needing to be seen. The cage of always needing to be chosen. The cage of becoming a product in someone else's marketplace. Men have learned, painfully, that every reward tied to someone else's opinion is just another leash. So they stopped reaching. And once they did, they found something terrifyingly pure, peace without permission. It's not about isolation. It's about liberation. A 2023 study from the Journal of Positive Psychology found that single men consistently reported higher long-term fulfillment. They spent more time in creative pursuits, physical training, and intellectual work. They reported greater independence, fewer regrets, and more self-respect. Meanwhile, their married counterparts, though praised by society, reported higher levels of chronic stress, emotional burnout, and suppressed resentment. Lower testosterone, higher weight gain, less sleep, more arguments, less autonomy. This isn't hearsay, it's data, and men are listening. Not to therapists telling them to open up, but to something deeper, that part of the masculine psyche that was never meant to be domesticated. The part that doesn't want to compromise, the part that doesn't want to explain, the part that doesn't want to constantly negotiate its existence. That part is waking up, and when it wakes, it doesn't scream. It disciplines. The modern man is not anti-love. He's anti-dependence. He's anti-fragility. Because he's realized something the system never wanted him to see. A man who is whole by himself is immune. Immune to guilt. Immune to manipulation. Immune to the bait of affection offered only as leverage. He doesn't fear losing anyone because he doesn't need anyone to survive. He has his routines, his silence, his mission. And once a man has tasted that kind of stability, he becomes unsellable. You can't market to him with sex. You can't scare him with loneliness. You can't shame him with outdated expectations. He's unplugged, and in that disconnection, he becomes untouchable. This is the new masculine awakening. Not loud, not performative, but surgical. Men across the world are cutting away their dependencies, one bad habit, one toxic relationship, one unspoken fear at a time. And what remains isn't bitterness. It's brutal clarity. They're not motivated by spite. They are motivated by the peace of not needing. They aren't trying to impress. They're trying to become the version of themselves no one applauded because no one understood. They don't want applause anymore. They want control. And with every day that passes, they move further away from desperation and closer to indifference. And indifference is where the power lives. Because once you no longer need to be loved, you are finally free to be feared, not by others, but by the systems that once thrived on your weakness. And that is the true awakening. History doesn't remember men who begged to be loved. It remembers men who stood alone and built anyway. The world is not shaped by those who waited for validation. It's shaped by those who chose mission over intimacy, purpose over pleasure, discipline over desire. Ernest Shackleton led his crew through 2 years of unrelenting ice, starvation, and hopeless odds in Antarctica. Not one man died under his command, not because of affection, but because of direction. He wasn't trying to be understood. He was trying to survive. And in that survival, he forged an immortal legend. Today's man, the awakened one, is channeling that same energy. He's not interested in shared playlists, couple selfies, and emotionally curated brunch dates. He doesn't want to perform emotional labor for someone who sees his pain as weakness. He wants to conquer his mind, master his body, own his time down to the second, because now he understands something society hoped he'd never realize. When a man stops outsourcing his purpose to romance, he becomes a threat to the order. He stops chasing relationships and starts building empires, not always literal, sometimes digital, intellectual, spiritual. Businesses, brands, philosophies, frameworks. This isn't just masculine ambition. This is what happens when emotional chaos is removed from the equation. With no one to impress, he hones. With no one to rescue, he transforms. With no one to please, he becomes lethal. He starts rising at 5, training twice a day, reading for knowledge, not distraction, strategizing instead of scrolling. Every hour not spent negotiating love is spent sharpening skill. And it adds up. 1 man in solitude becomes 10 in strength. A year of rejection becomes a decade of reinvention. The world sees him pulling away and assumes he's broken. But he's not retreating. He's recalibrating. Because love in its current form has become an emotional tax, a never-ending to-do list of compromise, compliance, and contingency. So instead of carrying that burden, he builds, and what he builds cannot be taken from him. A disciplined body, a liberated income, a fortress of thought no one else can corrupt. These aren't defenses against pain. They are declarations of sovereignty. And that's why the system begins to panic. Because systems don't fear desperate men. They fear fulfilled ones. Desperate men are easy to market to. They chase status. They buy affection. They overcompensate to feel enough. But the man who no longer plays that game cannot be lured, bribed, or shamed. He's not on dating apps. He's not in the comment section. He's not watching from the sidelines, hoping someone will understand his worth. He already understands it. And from that foundation, he doesn't build romance. He builds civilizations of thought. Some of these men go digital, building empires on code, crypto, and capital. Others go primal, building strength, forging discipline, reshaping their biology. Still others go philosophical, writing manifestos, launching movements, cultivating younger men. This isn't about legacy for applause. It's about legacy as defiance. Because every hour he spends on his mission is 1 hour stolen back from a system that only loved him when he was useful. And that's what terrifies the world. Not his strength, his indifference. He doesn't need sex to feel alive. He doesn't need praise to keep going. He doesn't need love to justify his existence. He is self-authorized. And once a man no longer needs to be seen, he becomes invisible to control. The rules were simple. Chase affection. Stay docile. Trade your fire for companionship. But now, he walks away from the game entirely. And when he walks away, the rules collapse. Because the rules only work when someone still agrees to play. So now, he writes new ones. Pain is fuel. Solitude is sacred. Focus is freedom. And love? Love is not rejected. It's replaced. Replaced by a higher calling. A deeper stillness. A daily war with himself that leads not to comfort, but to kingship. Because men who walk away from the game don't disappear. They evolve. And evolution doesn't beg for affection. It commands legacy. So here we are, a world that can no longer ignore the silence. The dating gurus shout louder. The corporate slogans grow more desperate. The media spins articles about lonely men and lost masculinity. Governments quietly panic over collapsing birth rates and disengaged workers. Because something's breaking, and it's not just tradition. It's the illusion of male dependence. For centuries, men were told their worth was tied to what they could earn, not just in money, but in affection. Be a good provider. Be strong, but not too strong. Be sensitive, but never weak. Give endlessly. Provide stability. Sacrifice. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll be loved. But now, that script is being thrown into the fire. Men aren't fighting it. They're walking away from it. Not in rage, in silence. And that silence is loud. They aren't protesting in the streets. They aren't begging for change. They aren't organizing revolutions. Because they've realized something more powerful than rebellion. You don't need to destroy the system if you simply stop feeding it. The man who retreats, not out of fear, but focus, is the final threat. Because his absence isn't passive. It's strategic. It's a vacuum that reveals how much the system relied on his silent compliance. The world is screaming for men to come back, to date, to marry, to spend, to smile, to serve. But the new man doesn't answer that call. He's not bitter. He's not broken. He's awake. He's tasted something too valuable to trade again. His own sovereignty. Because once a man stops begging for love, he starts demanding something far more terrifying to the world around him. Meaning, he no longer needs to be seen. He needs to see clearly. He doesn't want praise. He wants purpose. He doesn't long for attention. He longs for accuracy, for truth, for control over his time, his mind, his breath. And when a man reaches that place, he becomes still. And in that stillness, he becomes powerful. Because the peaceful man is not passive. He is disciplined, deliberate, difficult to manipulate. He doesn't chase. He doesn't apologize for needing space. He doesn't bend to the expectations of an emotional economy that feeds on his validation. He is not cruel, but he is clear, and clarity is the enemy of control. Because the world cannot sell to a man who's already full. It cannot shame a man who no longer craves acceptance. It cannot distract a man who finds more pleasure in a cold shower than a curated relationship. The peaceful man is the final threat because he needs nothing, and therefore, he cannot be broken. No strings to pull, no pressure points to exploit, no buttons to push. He's already turned inward and sealed the door behind him. He doesn't fight for dominance. He fights for silence, for space, for peace so intense, it feels like armor. And from that fortress, he watches the world flail in confusion. He sees friends trapped in relationships they hate, but are too afraid to leave. He sees men crushed under debt to impress people who wouldn't notice if they disappeared. He sees passionless lives numbed by screens, softened by compromise, shattered by the pressure to be liked. And he walks the other way, not because he thinks he's better, but because he refuses to die in slow motion. And you? Where are you in this spectrum? Still playing the game? Still begging to be seen? Still performing for attention that disappears the moment you stop clapping? Or have you felt it, that quiet pull towards something heavier, colder, but real? Validation or vigilance? Comfort or clarity? Love or power? The peaceful man doesn't choose rage. He chooses release. And in that release, he finds ascension. This isn't about hating anyone. It's about loving your freedom more than your fear of being alone. And that choice, once made, is irreversible. So if you feel it, even just a flicker, don't look away. Because what you're feeling is the beginning of your exit. Not from society, not from women, but from the illusion that you ever needed to be chosen to be complete. You don't. You never did. You're not a product. You're not a performance. You're not someone else's unfinished project. You're already the architect, and the world is terrified of men who remember that. If you made it this far, it means something inside you has already begun shifting. You didn't sit through this for entertainment. You stayed because something clicked, a truth too heavy to ignore. So here's the call. Drop one word in the comments. Peace. If you understand why, you're already one of us. Send this to one man, the one who's standing on the edge, the one who needs that final push to stop chasing and start building. And subscribe, not for me, but because something in you already decided to halfway through this video. What's coming next? We're going deeper, darker, colder, and it all starts underground.